Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 7 of the American Pageant titled The Road to Revolution. If you don't have the American Pageant, it's fine because the content's still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Republicanism is a system of government that encourages individuals to contribute to the common good of society. It was the principle of the New World that directly opposed to European hierarchical systems of power. So republicanism took hold in the colonies, while obviously it didn't take hold in the Old World. Radical Whigs, or British political commentators who feared corruption from monarchies. The ideas spread by the Whigs encouraged the colonists to be very protective over their own liberties and to be alerted to any move made by the British government. So radical Whigs really pushed an agenda that eventually sparked the American Revolution. Mercantilism was the idea that a country's power is measured based on gold and silver. Great Britain really took hold of this idea. This idea made Britain use the colonies for gold and silver, as well as export products to them exclusively. This made it so the colonies would not have a self-sufficient economy. Basically, they ordered so that the colonies could only mine for things like natural resources, metals, raw materials, which they'd sell back to Britain in exchange for food and things that help them survive. So they're basically just using the colonies. So this is not a state that the colonists wanted to be in. They wanted to be self-sufficient. So the whole idea of mercantilism also sparked revolutionary ideas. Navigation laws were laws that gave Britain more control over the colonies' imports and exports. It made Britain more rich off of the colonies' goods and created a money shortage in the colonies. All of this made the colonies more angry over being taken advantage of by Britain. So basically, the colonies couldn't sell and export and import things from anywhere they wanted. It had to be more exclusive with Britain. So this was just more control and angered them more. The Sugar Act raised taxes on colonial sugar. It was the first law passed by Parliament directly raising tax revenue from the colonies, specifically to serve the Crown. The Quartering Act required colonial households to provide for British troops. Before I go on any further, every single act that you see, like tax acts, the Quartering Act, things like that, you don't have to know every single one of them specifically, but you should know at least one of them to use as an evidence when you get the inevitable question about acts that British used to control the colonies. So the Quartering Act required colonial households to provide for British troops. It made the colonists angry that they had to pay for the unjust control being imposed on them. They had to, of course, have house soldiers in their homes. And they were like, why do I have to pay for the people that are controlling me? The stamp tax, tax on paper. All paper documents must be stamped, therefore taxed. It made the colonists very angry, and they started to defy all these laws, because they literally had to pay just to use cards, newspapers, anything like that. It was getting, at this point, a little ridiculous. Admiralty courts were courts paid by taxes that did not allow juries or innocent until proven guilty. So it violated the principles that colonists held dearly to them, like Enlightenment principles, which caused the colonies to become convinced that Britain wanted to restrict their liberties. So basically they were paying for courts that they had no standing in at all, no rights in at all. No taxation without representation became one of the most famous principles ever. The idea that Americans had to have seats in Parliament in order for Britain to tax them legally. Without this, the colonists decided that the taxation was robbery, and it denied their right to property. This led to revolutionary consequences when the British didn't allow the colonists to deny being taxed. So this principle really sparked the revolution. The Stamp Act Congress was when 27 delegates from 9 different colonies met to draw up a statement denouncing all these tax legislations from Britain. It was a step towards more intercolonial unity because the colonies were meeting together against Britain, although it took a long time for all the colonies to really band together. Non-importations agreements were colonists boycotting using British goods. It united ordinary colonists who normally would not have participated in these protests. It helped spread anti-British resistance throughout the colonies. So these simple acts where you just didn't use British goods really allowed anyone to contribute in the revolutionary efforts. Sons and Daughters of Liberty, violent colonial protest groups. Their willingness to use violence scared British law and tax enforcement. So the British tax laws could not actually affect the colonists because nobody could enforce them. Basically, these sons and daughters of liberty were stronger than the British tax collectors and people like that. The Declaratory Act was Britain declaring that they had a right to enforce anything over the colonies. It clearly states Britain's position that was against the view of the colonies, so the stages were really set for confrontation. The Townshend Acts were duties on various imports to the colonies. These acts inspired the colonists to be more non-compliant, which caused the British to send troops, which led to the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was when, of course, the 11 colonists died when the British troops fired on a chaotic colonial protest. The colonists jumped on the opportunity to spread propaganda through newspapers, pictures, paintings, things like that, against the British Army, which rallied revolutionary spirit even more. Committees of correspondence were small organizations aiming to spread colonial resistance. They evolved into intercolonial organizations where every colony had a central committee where they would share ideas and spread dissent against the British. So basically, every colony had a hub where they would just hate on Britain. The Boston Tea Party, another famous event when colonists dumped British tea into the Boston harbor. Conveniently, since everybody drank tea, tea leaves became a symbol of revolution. The British government cracked down even harder. So this is another example of these resistance efforts, just making it easier for any colonist to contribute to these efforts just by dumping their tea. Intolerable acts were various laws deemed intolerable by the colonists. In an effort to control the colonists and squash rebellion, they only inspired more revolutionary thoughts. Quebec Act was Britain resolving what to do with French Canadians. They gave them land accompanied by various orders. Each facet of the Quebec Act angered every subgroup of colonists, not just in Massachusetts, but in all 13 colonies, which made more of the colonial population have dissent towards Britain. So basically, it's just a pattern of every act Britain tried to pass, the colonists just didn't like it. The First Continental Congress was a meeting of 12 of the 13 colonies in Philadelphia to discuss how to resolve colonial grievances. John Adams was successful in swaying the Congress to adopt a more revolutionary course of actions towards resolving their grievances, because remember that you'll probably hear this a lot in your APUSH classes, that the colonists weren't fully embracing revolution even during the war. So this was just pushing them closer and closer to actual revolution, which essentially established an intercolonial sponsor of revolution. The association, a boycott against all British goods. The association became a symbol of whether you were a colonial supporter or a British supporter. The British supporters were called Loyalists. Lexington and Concord was the first battle of the American Revolution. It started the American Revolutionary War. Valley Forge was a colonial fort in Pennsylvania. The troops there were undersupplied, freezing, and dying. The weakness put on display at places like Valley Forge inspired the alliance with France. So things like this, where the colonial army was inexperienced and struggling, they have pushed the colonists closer and closer to allying with France during the war. Militia versus regulars. Militia were trained and regulars were not. Many of the colonial troops were just considered regulars. The regulars were trained, which added to the army. Camp followers, women who helped the army, so women really got involved in the war efforts. They helped to assist the troops who were not being sufficiently supplied at their camps. Baron von Steuben was a German drill master who came to America and trained all those colonial regulars. He helped the front lines of the Continental Army fight better against the highly trained Royal Army. Lord Dunmore's proclamation was a royal governor of Virginia promising American slaves freedom who fought for the British Army. Many blacks escaped from their plantations to join the army, which bolstered the amount of British troops fighting against the colonists. This proclamation is a little overplayed historically. It didn't vastly change, cause all slaves, free blacks to just join Britain. So don't get too caught up on this, but this is an important relationship to see how Britain was offering freedom to fight. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Goodbye.